Right. Of course, with that. Thank you so much, Mr. Saeed Ashtar, for joining us and talking to us. We're now joined by Mr. Fadel Abdul Ghany, who's a Syrian activist, joining us from Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Ghany. Now, Mr. Ghany, while we're talking about the Syrian context and conflict going on there, tell us more about how the elderly are more vulnerable in these settings. What is the cost to them? We've talked a lot about how young activists suffer, how the youth suffer, but specifically in this context, how are the elderly suffering?
I think Syria is the worst in the world in this regard because, as you know, like about 13 million from Syrians forcibly displaced interiorly or be refugees. Lots of, like the majority of those are youth, like the elder, like almost stay, refuse to join to their children or to their, even the elder refuse to displace inside Syria. So they almost stay and this actually, so that their children be apart from, like very far from them, they are unable. Like almost the youth in Syria refuse to be back to the regime area because they might be arrested or disappeared or tortured, or the regime actually recruit them again, forced to recruit them again in his army. And we have a research in this regard, and we found that the regime arrest about 2,000 persons when they return back from the refugees, and even from the displaced area when the regime seized those areas. So this caused this disaster situation for those elders. This is from the first hand. Then from the second hand, in the economic side, now the elder engage again in manage their life because, as I mentioned, the youth and their children also be away from them. So they now take care about themselves, maybe their wife as well, and that's so difficult. And when the elder be a female and her husband maybe disappeared and her children also be far away, so that's more difficulties from the gender side as well. She'll take care for herself. Actually, it's so difficult to talk about the deportation between the families. Even right. For example, in some neighbor country, it's the family is also segregated between each other.
Right. Now, Mr. Tang, as Mr. Ghany, Mr. Ashtar both highlighted in conflict zones how the elderly have to become more self-reliant because of the toll that it takes on the youth, on the younger generations. Trying to link that to what is happening in Hong Kong with the aging population and how you talked about there being an opportunity with the elderly, they can join the workforce. What additional investment is needed by the government, because the elderly in many cases are out of touch with technology, with certain programs? What needs to be done in order to make them more productive?
There are two types of programs necessary. One type is a kind of channels for them to remain in contact with the society so that they are aware of job opportunities, so that they stay in contact with various types of community organizations, with their neighbors and so on. The other type of programs will largely be educational, so much so that they may learn how to use the internet, how to use various channels to seek information, to keep themselves informed, to remain competent and active in the labor force, and so on. Basically, these programs should not be too costly, and they should be made more widespread. They should be, and the elderly people should be made aware of these programs. A kind of social service network, well established and reaching to the grassroots level, should be the key to allow these two types of programs to be established and to be effective and fruitful.
Right. And how well is Hong Kong coming on that path in doing all of this and implementing these programs?
One has to rely on the government to provide funding. Fortunately, the Hong Kong government is rich enough to do that. But I think in East Asia and in places like Hong Kong, various voluntary bodies are being used, so to speak. Various types of religious bodies, churches and monasteries, naturally are quite ready to provide these services. And above all else, it is important to establish the grassroots network so that ordinary people should be able to come to help and to spread the information. Voluntary work should be encouraged, and I think this is becoming more and more widespread, and it is important to cultivate the sense of satisfaction among ordinary people so that when they deliver voluntary services, they get a sense of satisfaction. They feel that they have been doing something good, they have made a contribution. And I think this is important. It is very much a part of civil society developing.
Right. On that point, thank you so much, Ms. Chang, for joining us and talking to us. We're now joined by Ms. Maram Sosli, who's a Syrian activist joining us from Perth. Thank you so much for joining us, Ms. Sosli. Now, while we're talking about the vulnerable populations and how important certain infrastructure is for their healthcare, for their well-being, now talking about conflict zones, of course, the systems are completely shattered. In this case, how important is it for these people to have reliable infrastructure in terms of healthcare? And what is the state right now that we're witnessing?
Well, before the war began in Syria in 2011, Syria was pretty much 98% self-sufficient, produced all its own drugs. Healthcare was free. But the war has caused so much damage to so many hospitals, the pharmaceutical industry, the factories, doctors as well. A lot of them have left the country to Europe and Germany. So this has led to not only the cost of medicine increasing, but the amount of availability of medicine to decrease as well. And especially for children who have cancer, because of all the medication that Syria has been able to produce for itself using its own technology, much of the cancer drugs for leukemia is not within Syria's capability of producing. And unfortunately, sanctions on Syria has made it very, very difficult to treat children with cancer. These sanctions are being placed on oncology medication as well as other medications. So for Syria to be able to get back on its feet, obviously sanctions are going to need to be lifted, and some money is going to be needed to rebuild that infrastructure that was lost during the war.
The indiscriminate targeting of civilians and infrastructure. Of course, it's seen that only society can progress or get back to normal, rehabilitate itself after the war has ended. But before that, what do you think can be done? What do you think needs to be done in terms of this indiscriminate killing, this indiscriminate targeting, and ruining civilian infrastructures? What lines need to be drawn here right now during the conflict?
Well, you know, whether it's indiscriminate or not is arguable. And I think there's a certain level of one-sided blindness going on here. There have been records of recently this year, the rebels bombing Syrian government-held areas with chemical weapons. And of course, the United Nations hasn't given any side, the responsibility for that. But the question is, if the idea is that the US is imposing sanctions on Syria for humanitarian reasons, this is completely naive. The US has destroyed Raqqa. It has bombed Syria's oil infrastructure. It's occupying Syrian land, preventing Syria from accessing its own oil. And of course, there's water shortages as well.
Since we're running short on time, I do want to talk about again, what can be done right now? What needs to be done? You're saying that it's arguable what the civilian casualties are, but we do see that there are civilian casualties. What needs to be done in terms of setting certain boundaries?
If talking about infrastructure, then we have to talk about economy. We have to end the occupation, allow Syria to regain control of its own resources, water, oil, food, agriculture, and end the sanctions as well. That's the only way to rebuild infrastructure. In terms of the war, basically we need civilian corridors open for civilians to get out of rebel-held territory, because as we know, Al-Qaeda is in control of Idlib. The US has admitted this. So we need safety corridors and end of sanctions.
Right. On that point, thank you so much, Ms. Maram Susti, for joining, Mr. Fadel Abdul Ghany for joining us. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we just take a closer look at how stress impacts child development and whether some forms of stress are in fact necessary for a healthy development. Stay with us.